We're going to, I have started the recording. Yes, Michelle, I think we're on. And Leroy, if you want to turn your video off, we'll have the presenters with their video.
Good deal. I will do that. Let me do that now. All right, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to turn this over to Gene Krebs. He's an author and he's also an AHA process consultant. And this is a session on the impact of the built environment on poverty.
Well, thank you all very much for attending here today. So during the earlier presentations, I got so inspired that I ran downstairs and I picked up this little thing here. Now, this is also called a Leatherman tool. And as you see, when you open it up, it's got a variety of tools within it. A pair of pliers, a saw, bottle openers, Phillips screwdrivers, knives, flathead screwdrivers. The Bridges Out of Poverty model is not unlike a Leatherman tool. One of the things you heard this morning was the fact that many people are applying this in ways that I'm still stunned when I hear people talk about how all different ways. Today we're going to talk about a aspect of this, and it's something I really want you all to, as anti-poverty advocates, to be able to begin to understand on a daily basis. And that is the impact of our built environment on poverty and on your efforts to help people move up the economic ladder. You know, the first think tank I worked for after I got out of politics, I am president of Ohio Association of Recovering Politicians, is one that was dealing with smart growth, the built environment. And so I've always been able to apply this lens, if you will, to our poverty issues. So with that, I'll go ahead and go into this little presentation. So here's the cliche for our times. Crises like a war or a pandemic tend to accelerate a trend that would have unfolded over 20 years and compress it down to 20 weeks. Now, I will tell you that I used to say 20 months, but now I've come to realize that it's even shorter than what my initial analogy predicted it would be. So everything's moving along very quickly. Here's another cliche adopted by Bridges Across Every Divide, which I co-authored with Phil Duvall. The impact of COVID-19 will be spread around like soft butter on warm toast, will not be spread around like soft butter on warm toast, but rather like cold butter on Wonder Bread. It's going to be spread around in a very lumpy manner. COVID-19 is going to affect some communities much harsher than other ones. And we've already seen that with some data on the various racial impacts of this. You heard a little bit about health earlier this morning. And so we need to be able to think about this. This is going to affect Scarsdale much different than it's going to affect Brooklyn. So how do Bridges advocates adapt? It's time to step up your game. What are the core issues behind poverty? And one of the things I like about the Bridges approach is that it helps everybody begin to peel back the onion and get down to what are those core issues. So how does the built environment impact your poverty? And so what do you mean by that? So first of all, what is smart growth? It's easier to say what is dumb growth. Dumb growth is when you get off the interstate and you're supposed to have a meeting at a Panera Bread, and you can see the sign for Panera Bread, but you can't get to Panera Bread. Okay, that is dumb growth. It is wasteful, it's sprawl driven, and if you look down from outer space, the automobile is the dominant species in America, okay, and Canada. Sorry, folks in Toronto, it works there too. What is the impact then of the built environment on the economic and health ecosystem in your community? Now, one of my favorite quotes from C.S. Lewis is, the next best thing to being wise oneself is to live in a circle of those who are. So that's why I asked Ilana and Frances to come on to this presentation with me, because whereas I am like a Leatherman tool to a certain degree, I'm good at doing minor fixes, but these two young ladies really know their stuff. And with that, we're going to have in front of you, you have Ilana's a very condensed version of her bio, but I want Ilana to talk briefly for about 2 minutes. What motivates you, what interests you, and how you got into this particular space?
Thank you, Gene. I am very excited to be here today, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this today. My background also comes at this from a perspective of place. I believe that every person has the right to live in a great place, to have opportunities, to build wealth for their family, and to live in a place that they love. Some people might think that that is a dream that's pie in the sky, but I think it's in fact incredibly attainable. My work really focuses on how do we bring good paying jobs, specifically through small scale manufacturing businesses, which are businesses that create any kind of tangible good that you can replicate or package. How do we bring those back into town? How do we bring them into downtown, onto Main Street? These businesses are mostly 20 people or fewer, and the opportunity to work at these businesses, as well as to be an entrepreneur to launch a business like this, is completely inclusive. It doesn't matter what your background is, and it doesn't matter where you come from, and it doesn't matter your education or your history. But this kind of business means that you know how to make something and you can learn entrepreneurship. And these businesses fit into our empty storefronts, into the places that have been left behind in a lot of communities. And so I work with communities and with real estate developers to bring these businesses back into downtown, but also to support them through business development programming, and to make sure we're doing it in an equitable and inclusive way to create more opportunity for more.
I would just like to quickly
introduce my apologies. Could everyone please mute if not a presenter?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Try them. They're new.
Yeah, it's kind of boring, I think.
If you're not a presenter on this session, can you please mute?
I want to take a trip to Pumpkin Stick.
Also, whoever is the official organizer within GoTo might be able to mute everybody, and then just the three of us can unmute ourselves in case you need that.
That's how it is right now. So yes. So thank you. Please go on.
That was it. Back to you, Gene.
Oh, okay. Well, you caught me in mid refreshment. Well, then, Frances, once again, you have Frances's bio in front of you. Once again, like Ilana's, there's a lot of gaps in it. So, Frances, talk a little bit about what motivates you to have gotten involved in this particular field of endeavor.
So this is an interesting topic because how we approach transforming lives is oftentimes encumbered by our built environment, which is the topic today with this crowd. And unfortunately, because bricks are bricks, it's hard to move things quickly. Once something's built in a manner or in a fashion, it can have an effect that lasts for some period of time, which makes things easy. And to a degree is a useful thing, but also can be not so great. So my name's Frances Mennone, and I'm an Ohioan like Gene, but I work for a development firm based in Baltimore, Cross Street Partners, and we do urban redevelopment projects in really tough to deal with spaces. If it's a project that no one else will do, we will get involved in it. I should probably not call ourselves nonprofit developers, but that's pretty much what we are. We are not. We are a for-profit developer, but oftentimes we work in heavily subsidized communities. And we, when I go to conferences and people give me the logo developer, it's a little amusing because that's sort of antithesis of what we actually want to do. But we do a lot of work with communities using all the tools and tricks of the trade, which is various financing mechanisms. And excited to be here today to talk about how the built environment really affects the work that you all do through your daily lives with the people who are impacted by that environment.
Well, thank you. And once again, I've known these two young ladies now for, I won't say how long, but a very long time. And they are two, as you can tell, two of the most impressive young people out there in their particular sectors working on this. So this is a sampling, and we do want you to go ahead and send your questions in, okay, in the chat box. Please go ahead and put your questions in. But we're going to start off here with a sampling, because one of the things that we want to do, this is all about Frances and Ilana. This is not about me. We want to get information from them on this. So some of the questions are, how do you talk to developers, and what are developers interested in?
I'll take that one first. So I will say, whether you are a nonprofit developer or a sort of, the typical for-profit developer, developers oftentimes talk in very large platitudes about, we're going to bring this to your community and it's going to be great. And it can be, it's very typical that the developer is talking in sort of soaring rhetoric about how whatever it is that they're working on is going to be so great for their particular community. I think it's important, people can get wrapped up in that if you're not in that daily work often and don't identify that as being just sort of comes with the territory. So approaching a conversation with a developer, having a concept in mind for the type of work you want done before you get into the conversation is a useful way of approaching developers or soliciting developers to your community.
There's also, I think, an amazing opportunity to actually train people from a community to become the developers in the community, especially when we're looking at small projects, the things that might be a corner store, with space above it, or something that might be on an old main street that's really been neglected for a long time. There are wonderful programs like the Incremental Development Alliance and Jumpstart in Philadelphia that train people from the neighborhood to understand how to do these small projects. And I start with that because I think that ownership of the neighborhood is actually really important, so that the businesses that go into those storefronts are from people in the neighborhood, that they support the people who live in the neighborhood, and that it's in fact a way for people to build wealth for their families and for their community. It can be a big risk, right? And so sometimes, like what Frances talks about, there's other financing that needs to be a part of it, or it needs to have local government support for the project to even make financial sense. They call it to pencil. But I think that there's a really important role for a community to think about how do we become developers ourselves? How do we create something like a land bank where the community can actually buy or take over some of the properties so that it can be redeveloped over time as people are ready, as opposed to only looking out and looking for some big one project that might save the day in a community. Because I would say 9 times out of 10, the one big project from somebody who comes from outside the community is not going to be the grand solution. It won't serve the needs of the people who live there now, or it won't be of the quality that the community actually needs, because like Frances was talking about, the community doesn't yet know what to ask for. And it may not be at a point where it can say, we want this high quality thing, even though we don't look like that right now. So I think that looking at redevelopment of existing properties in some ways is really important, looking at local individuals as local small scale developers. And then really looking at the numbers. A lot of projects in a lot of parts of the country don't make financial sense right now because the property value and the rent or the leases that people can get for the space are so low when the cost of construction is really high. And so having a local government or a local nonprofit that can really look at those numbers together with the community to see what that gap is in real numbers becomes an essential step too.
Okay. Follow up, Frances?
Yeah, oftentimes when you see so many communities that are soliciting development, and they get to a point almost where they would love to see something new happen, but there has not been an analysis done. Certain sectors of the community want to have something new and exciting happening, and they haven't really done a comprehensive analysis as to what they might be looking for. And so I think that's super important. it can be very hard to do, to stop and say, wait, we don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth here, but do we really want that here? And if you have a plan ahead of time with your community, that certainly helps guide that much better.
So, Ilana, you mentioned land banks, and that's on the list of things I want to get to. But before we get to there, I think what probably 90% of the folks who are watching this are wanting to really, really know is, how do I get affordable housing into my community? Are there tricks of the trade? How do you entice developers to do something like this? You folks have any insights on this?
I'm sure we both do. I would say first look at the buildings that are already there. A lot of times, especially in smaller cities and towns, there's second floor of Main Street that's not being used, that can be renovated to be affordable housing and bring people downtown. And so existing building renovation is most of the time going to be more affordable than any kind of new construction. I think in terms of affordable housing, the other question then becomes, where does it make most sense? How do you make sure that you're creating opportunity for people alongside affordable housing? I always talk about, we think about affordable housing, which is essential, but we never pair that with thinking about good paying jobs. And so if we're going to really talk about how we help people grow out of poverty, then I think we have to pair it with that question of, what are the good paying jobs? How do we help train people up for this? Is entrepreneurship for themselves part of the solution? I always think about, there are tons of people who have an entrepreneurial spirit. They just don't know how to formally turn that into a business. And so I think that on the one hand, it is looking at affordable housing, and there's tons of tools, right? There are tons of technical tools like low-income housing tax credits that developers can use in a project. But I think it really comes down much more to the vision for the neighborhood, the vision for the community, and what people need. It may not be tons of new construction development. There's often incremental steps that a community can take. But there are some great national developers like what Frances does, where they can take on sometimes it's even a for-profit affordable housing developer, because they understand the financing so well. And I actually just spoke to, if I can remember their name, I will tell you this. A development company that goes really focusing in on housing for people at 80% of the average income, right? They're really focusing in on what is often called workforce housing, the teachers, the firefighters. And they're building hundreds and hundreds of these units of these apartments in different markets. And so there are different people nationally who are focusing on this and can be a part of the solution. But I would think about the scale and the goal first, and really specifically how does it connect in with the community?
And Ilana, I understand about the fact about you're thinking of somebody, but you can't remember their name, because I have medication to help me with my memory, but I've misplaced it. And I know if I could just remember where I put it, I know I'd get better. So Frances then, so we have out there right now. Oh, and could both of you young ladies do me the favor of, when you're not answering the question, send into the chat box your contact. We have it listed on the PowerPoint, but send in your contact information again on the chat box, because we want people to cut and paste that too if they would like to access it. And so Frances, I'm sitting here. I'm a anti-poverty advocate in town X, somewhere in the North American continent, and I want to bring affordable housing. What's the first steps that I take to talk to a developer, to entice a developer, and how do you even find the right developer for this?
So as Ilana was talking too, when affordable housing has its own stereotypes that gets associated with it, and I hadn't thought about this until she prompted me with this thought, but when you talk about LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, or when you talk about the various HUD policies that are out there, programs that are out there, oftentimes the community itself doesn't. There's an assumption that affordable housing means you're bringing in a particular type of element, and until you address that you need to speak about it with your community in a way that they're aware of what you're trying to do, and that they're not putting their own bad memories on say a HUD policy, a program that has long gone by the way of the dodo. So I mean, to answer your question about trying to get a housing development, affordable housing development into any particular community, I think one of the things that often gets the misstep is forgetting to have the conversation with the community themselves about what is that affordable housing. Is it Section 8? Because that's what everybody thinks it's going to be in their head, or is it, what does that look like? And creating examples of positive subsidized housing or showing examples of precedents set in other communities. There are beautiful affordable housing developments all over the country, and people hear affordable and they get cringy about it, which is not useful in our work.
Okay. So here's a cliche, I think, for the advocates. I'm going to present for them to write down. They may not want to remember this one, but it's leave your baggage at the airport carousel. Okay. You may have had preconceived ideas as to how all this stuff works, what people's real motivation is, but British folks are remarkably good at leaving our preconceived ideas behind and looking at things from a new and refreshing perspective, which then brings me to, one of the things that is very refreshing about, especially what Ilana is talking about here, is, the built environment and workforce and urban manufacturing. And if there's one big strength of Bridges is we tend to take a holistic look at variety of things. So we're talking here workforce, built environment, urban manufacturing. Ilana, how would an advocate make that work for them?
So I come at it from this perspective. We have a few really hot markets where we need affordable housing and people are getting displaced. We have a ton of places where the market is completely shot, where the housing is actually worth maybe less than what's constructed on it in a lot of places, because so many of our communities have been left behind even before the struggles of COVID. And that's really important to acknowledge. We nationally have an income inequity larger than we've ever had historically, right? We have a racial wealth gap that's almost completely unchanged in the last 50 years, even with all of the things that we've tried to do. So we were not doing a good job even before COVID, and COVID has made many of these things worse, like Gene said, lumpy in different places, and the impacts are different in different places. That being said, I think we have not only a responsibility, but we actually have an economic benefit to making sure that more people have good paying jobs in their community. And I look at small scale manufacturing because it is an open opportunity. There are people who know how to make things across any dividing line that you can imagine in our community, or that you know of and experience in our community. There are people who know how to make things. And so there are all of these different ways that we can tie those people together, teach them how to launch a small business online, teach them how to sell and be a stable small business, even if it's just a one-person business. And I don't say even just, I actually think having a one-person business where that person can build wealth for themselves and their family is an enormous success. And it's one of the ways that we can help people break out of generational poverty, is by creating that kind of opportunity. And so there are programs, there are startup programs, and there are programs to help people scale their businesses. And those are sort of general ones that in many cases, honestly, assume a certain level of education, assume a cultural background that's specific to middle or upper class, and they leave a lot of people behind. And so I think one of the things to look at, especially when we're looking at generational poverty or even situational poverty, is how are we creating entrepreneurship programs that reach people no matter what their background is, and really working with that specific community in that place to understand what is their gap to make sure that they can become a business. And there are programs across the country that are working on this that are very localized, that are honestly, they're often in the neighborhood because that's where people feel comfortable becoming part of a program like this. It's not asking them to take the bus or travel across town to some other program. It's brought into the neighborhood. And so then once we can teach people entrepreneurship, we can connect the dots between how you make a thing, the hot sauce that's the family recipe, the amazing quilts that people can make, the woodwork that might be the family skill that's been handed down for generations, and we can help them turn those into small, successful businesses. And if they're wildly successful, maybe they can hire a couple people from the neighborhood. But if we start looking at individuals who can build wealth for themselves this way, and then each one of these, let's say 10 businesses that thrives, might be able to hire 5 people from the neighborhood, all of a sudden we have wealth building within the neighborhood that isn't dependent on the outside world in terms of other things. It's dependent on a market where people understand how to operate and really can sell things and thrive, and then ultimately maybe become businesses in the storefronts that have an open storefront where people can come in and buy things, but they're not dependent on the incomes in the neighborhood for their sales. Most of their revenue is coming in online through online sales. And so all of a sudden they activate a storefront, they become energy for a neighborhood, they're hiring in the neighborhood, people are earning incomes, and then we look at that wealth building opportunity. So then it's not just about needing affordable housing, it's about creating those good paying jobs.
Okay. Okay. You know, and you bring up a very important point I never thought of until now. That some of you might be able to tell from my particular video here that I'm a little bit herky-jerky. And that's because if there's such a thing as the information superhighway, I live on the information dirt road, you know, out here in rural Ohio. And so you're making a very good point that as they begin, then we need to think about it not just as they're going to sell it in their community, but they may have the advantage of having better internet capabilities than what we have out here in rural Ohio, which, you know, I acknowledge bringing broadband to rural America is going to be very expensive. It's going to be a very long-term thing. You make a very interesting point on that. And then you also bring up about, you know, putting all these different programs together and everything. And so Frances and I reconnected at a state historic tax credit for rehabilitation tool in Dayton, Ohio, a few years back. And Frances, as communities go ahead and start looking at these types of programs, you know, for the built environment, workforce, urban manufacturing, that type of stuff, can you talk a little bit about, because you are a expert on putting together packages, and Ilana brought up you need to come into this with a package. How would a typical poverty advocate begin to approach this on a package building basis?
Well, I'm going to answer your question in a minute, but you two have sparked another thought in my head. In the United States, we have gotten, I'm going to avoid your question. We have gotten so far away from what our local economies have really gotten sort of ripped apart in the last 50 years, where a lot of the wealth that's developed inside a community gets exported elsewhere, say by way of having a dollar store or the Walmart nearby. And for better or for worse, the funding, the monies that flow through that system don't stay inside the community. There's no longer a local bodega. There's no longer the local grocery store that's community owned or owned locally. It all goes to a different pot of funds. And so, or a different, it goes outside the community. And so hopefully in a post-COVID world, we can start to renew. And what prompted my thought on this was in regards to manufacturing as well. When you think about urban manufacturing, my go-to in my head was literal manufacturing. We need to be doing more in our post-COVID world about designing locations that can survive based on having supplies and workforces that are right here, instead of relying upon things coming from outside, but also keeping the wealth that builds and the knowledge and the know-how inside that city, community, village. But so oftentimes communities, it depends on, so Gene, ask me your question again now that I've deviated from your question so far.
No, that's perfectly fine. This is the purpose of this, is that have the two of you respond to each other much more than me. I'm supposed to, I'm like a radio DJ. There's not supposed to be a whole lot of empty air moments on this thing, okay? So going back to building upon, so Ilana mentioned, putting together the whole package. And one of the things, Frances, you're a recognized leader in is building that financial package. So what sort of package, how would you begin to approach this if a poverty advocate was to come to you and say, I'd like to do something along these lines? I heard this here today. Your contact information for both of you young ladies is embedded in the PowerPoint. It may even find it on the chat room. If I were 40 years younger and a anti-poverty advocate in some city somewhere, some county somewhere, I'd be going, my gosh, I need to know how to do this stuff. So how would you begin to look at putting together a package for this, Frances?
Yeah, I mean, to tie it back into what I was saying at the top too, I think getting your community together with regards to aligning goals inside your own community about what it is that you're trying to go after, and making sure that you're addressing the needs of the community itself first, primarily, and then thinking about the types of things what's needed. Funding flows into projects, or success breeds success, right? So if you have a compelling idea for what it is you're trying to solve for, with regards to community, say for example, more affordable housing in your community, and you need it, putting together a group of individuals and development companies, I'm happy to help provide those that would be interested in participating in this, but oftentimes it's a cadre of not just one firm, but multiples that are involved in a particular project. And first you put together get your compelling idea put together the right team that would be associated with that, because people are better or worse in different arenas. And then like I said, if it's a compelling enough concept, then it's much easier to be able to find funding to go with it.
Okay.
But I really liked what Ilana was saying, because oftentimes we think it's got to be a 600-unit housing development for affordable housing, when really it can just be start with small bites, and think about it in terms of a win would be 20 new affordable housing units, because trying to go after 600 could take you years and years and years.
Okay. All right. I see we're getting a lot of questions in the chat room, but before we get down to some of those, the next one on this list you see on the PowerPoint is when we survey, and I have to give full props here to Dr. Beth Waller out of Indiana University, who has been surveying low-income folks for several years now. The lack of transportation, low-cost transportation opportunities always comes up in the top 5, 3, somewhere along there. Do you have any hints for folks as to how they can begin to develop a community that is more attractive to more transit opportunities for folks?
There's a number of different funding sources that help incentivize TODs, transportation-oriented development, and so those are some of those tools are more prevalent in major metros, but the tools used in major metros, such as incentivizing transportation-oriented development, could be, just because it works. We're pretty good at taking ideas from one part of the country and trying to implement it in other parts. So assuming that it won't work because your community is not as large as say, a much larger metro,
Mm-hmm.
I would advise folks to err on the side of analyzing the potential tools and maybe by way of having, say, 20 or so transportation oriented, you might be able to create a larger package out of your community than you realize with regards to the types of development you might be looking for. But there are many parts of the country that are interested in doing or that help incentivize transportation-oriented development.
Okay, transit-oriented development. And Ilana, what do you want to say something?
I would just say make a place.
Okay.
At the simplest way to say transit, especially, I mean, bus is going to be different than rail, any kind of rail, but transit needs a crowd of people for it to succeed. It needs to have a place where there's a lot of people and a lot of businesses, either a lot of people who live there or a lot of businesses or both. And so the more that a community can invest in its neighborhood main street, for instance, if you're part of a bigger metro area where there's transit in some places, but not where you are, the more that you can invest in your neighborhood main street, the more you can move up that list of priority to become a place that might be more appealing. The decisions of where transit stops go is incredibly political. And so making those kinds of neighborhood improvements and those neighborhood investments helps increase the sort of exposure at the political level. The other way is to go after the politics straight on and create an advocacy campaign saying, you know, we were skipped last time. We are a place that has been underinvested in for generations, which is true of many, many neighborhoods, especially if they are neighborhoods of Black, Latino, and other people of color that have been skipped over for generations in investment. And so being able to make the political advocacy case that this is a place that needs investment. I will say one thing though, transit stations come with increasing property values often. And so if you want to go after that as a neighborhood, I would think about who owns the property, how does the neighborhood retain ownership of that property, and really thinking about a land bank or some other, or a community development corporation as a means to say, we want to have the station, but we want to control our own fate. And having control of some of that property before you go after the station advocacy, it might be a good way to get there.
Well, then that leads directly into a question from Jamie Crone, and that I'll just read it here. And by the way, folks, as I will try to get to the questions. I may skip one because I've not done this for 6 months. So, you know, so Jamie says, as that wealth is built in the community and taxes are raised as the area becomes valuable to the municipality, should communities petition to have tax breaks like corporations to have limited time to build wealth and grow it before taking on full tax responsibility? Also, should there be restrictions on rental property so home ownership can give more opportunities for building wealth?
So there are tons of programs in different communities that give tax breaks to businesses or to new real estate development. Sometimes it's in lieu of, right, is the phrase that they use often, in lieu of taxes. The other way to think about it, though, that might be better is to think about, especially if you're looking at a neighborhood center or a town center, is an improvement district that says, we're going to take this increment of taxes that we're all still going to pay in, but as our values increase, that increment we're going to pay into is actually going to be reinvested right in this area, so that we're capturing some of that value to reinvest in that specific place. And so that's another way to do it. I do think that when we talk about rentals versus home ownership, there is a 800-pound gorilla, right? After the last Great Recession, not the one that we're at the start of right now, but in the last one, when all the foreclosures happened, we had major institutional buyers buy up tons and tons of single-family homes all over the country. And so now we have neighborhoods that used to be incredibly stable with homeowners that are now almost all rental properties, or like 80 or 90% rental properties. And people who have been long-term homeowners are feeling the impact of that in terms of the lack of investment in those properties, because there's a lot of neglect going on, the lack of quality of improvements that is going on in those homes, and the impact on theirs. So I don't know of any place, and Frances or Gene might know differently, I don't know of any place that has been able to restrict who buys that property as it comes up for sale, or who can restrict how much rental property there is in a market. I do know places that work on the flip, as they really work on increasing homeownership, or they work with Habitat for Humanity to build new homes that are affordable on small lots to make sure that more people from the community can buy into that neighborhood. There's a lot of that work going on in High Point, North Carolina, where I did a project a couple years ago, where the South Side neighborhood in High Point is the historic Black neighborhood. There was tons of homes that got lost into rental properties during the recession. And so the city is working with Habitat and working with the neighborhood to start putting single family houses back into either the places that have completely lost out and need to be scraped and rebuilt, or into the vacant lots that can be redeveloped like that. So I think it takes some purposeful work like that.
You know, you touched upon a question that was asked by Jessica Dijon, and that is it possible to sell your home with a disclaimer you wish to sell to a low-income buyer versus a developer in order to prevent gentrification? Your answer is essentially no, but now you're touching one of the big issues of development for low-income people, is they want to see development because of the jobs it can bring, and then it can also bring gentrification. And so this is a completely open-ended question. Is gentrification a good thing, a bad thing? Is it just a thing? And can you create a way that gentrification is just a good thing? Is it possible to do that? Who wants to touch this field?
I can take that on. Frances, you can start if you want.
Oh my goodness, yeah, I don't know if I was trying to, as I read your slide earlier, I was thinking, is there really a way to describe gentrification as being a good thing? I mean, I think oftentimes what is the most polarizing thing about it is that you've got a new set of folks that come into the community and are building new structures, doing redevelopment work, and they're not taking into context who was there first and how they then can play a role in all of this. So to my point about being local, yeah, sure, maybe those new developers are local, but it's not local specifically to the people who were there in the first place. So I think when you think about gentrification, you have got to be very intentional about making sure that you engage with the community as you're doing your development work. And if by any means or measure you can incorporate them literally in the wealth building, and the national philanthropies have been working on this for a while now to try and figure out how to have the community be part of the sort of new ownership, if you will. That has to come with a development group or community that development group that wants to do that, and community that wants to is encouraged to participate. So I think like I said, with regards to gentrification, the best way to deal with it is to try and prevent it in the first place.
Well, and I think there's two different things, right? There's investment in a place, which isn't a bad thing. We need investment in places that have been underinvested in for a long time, but we don't want displacement. And there is a space in between that takes really purposeful, very intentional work to create. But I think it's important to separate those two pieces. I think if somebody owns their own home and they want to sell it and reap all of the revenue and wealth out of that home as the values go up around them, they have every right to do that, right? And that is one of the ways that people build wealth for themselves. If a community is bringing in new investment and new development along a main street, and the community has not been involved, and the main street isn't going to represent the people in the community, we in fact almost never talk about commercial displacement, right? If the local businesses or the businesses that serve the local community aren't on its commercial streets anymore, then people don't feel like they belong anymore also. And so we have commercial displacement that happens in a lot of communities before we even have the housing displacement. And so we need to think about how these different pieces come together. And like Frances was talking about, I think the essential piece is engaging the people who live there now. What are the things that they want to see? What's their vision of an amazing place to live? Like, take the magic wand, wave it around. What does it feel like to walk down that street on a Saturday afternoon? And what do they want to see there? And then how does development actually help do that? There are tons of policies that can make developers include housing for people that is affordable, right? There are also policies that help developers include small retail fronts for locally owned businesses. There's lots of ways that we can add those kinds of requirements into developments. And some of the savviest small developers that I've met actually figure out how that they can create the housing above it to completely cover the cost of the ground floor retail, so that they can purposefully make sure that that ground floor retail is from the neighborhood, is of the community that's there. And so it's really important to look at those kinds of pieces. So I think investment is important and essential, but it has to be purposefully done with the community that's there, in partnership with them. And that's the basis of all the work that we do with Recast City, is going into the community to find out who owns businesses, who's making things, what do they need, what kind of space do they need, and what kind of business development support that they need. So then we can go to the property owners and the developers and say, okay, this is what's needed. City, or county, how are you going to play a role in this if we're trying to achieve this specific outcome of building wealth in the community, or creating space for locally owned businesses.
And you just touched on, it's on my mind now, you bring up food deserts. And if you talk to your more urban folks, the city folks, or not the county folks who are involved in the Bridges movement, you're gonna go, we have a huge food desert problem. Okay, that there's no place for people within a 15-block area to go buy fresh produce. There's always a convenience store that will sell you single cigarettes.
I don't know. Okay. I'll just listen to it. I'll be fine.
Okay, that's somebody just came in and said yes. That's nice to know. And so the question is then, can advocates create a environment where the developer during this process goes, yes, I do want to put in a small grocery store to alleviate your food desert issues? Is that possible in this, or is this just a pipe dream?
I want to jump in here. So so a lot of you're hitting on all the sort of the third rails, right, of community development, food deserts, housing, workforce development. One thing I want to say about this, and I think this is why I think it's important for the locality to have an idea of what they want their community to grow into, is that the funding sources for these programs are state, local, federal. They come from all different avenues, but oftentimes the funding sources are designed in a way that there isn't a comprehensive look at the community that you're working in to look at all of those things at one time. There's a funding source that comes in, and okay, now we've got this particular manner from the FDA or for a way of dealing with our food desert issue, and it's out of context with the fact that there's no affordable housing anywhere nearby, but there's an opportunity here, so people just rush forward with what they've got. We're not going to be able to solve how the federal government sprinkles money on us from Washington, but what we can do is create catchment, essentially community development, CDC's community development. What else? Ilana can help me finish it, but organizations inside the cities you're working in, communities you're working in, that help align the goals of the community with the funding sources, so that it's not the tail wagging the dog all the time. Because we could have a great transit-oriented development going on, but if it's totally disconnected from what some of the other needs are, then it's really not singing the way it should. So by having a comprehensive quasi-governmental group, sometimes port authorities can do this, that can align the federal funding with the goals of the community, that is a great way to deal with this issue.
So if I hear you correctly, what advocates need for their community, they may not call it this, but essentially we're talking a strategic plan.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't even think they need that much. I think they just need to have a vision. Like, I believe in really short-term fixes, right? What are the things that we can do in the next few months? 3 to 6, 12 at the most. What can we do to make it feel like it's changing? And so I often talk with people about that magic wand. Like, what do you want it to feel like, look like as you're walking down the street on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon? And just getting people to sort of have that, understand what that shared vision is and believe that it's possible. I often think when places do official strategic plans or official economic development strategies, they're looking at 5 and 10 year and these really long-term things that people feel like they're not getting anything out of. So I would really encourage people to look at super incremental short-term wins that look and feel like change is happening. It might be renovating a vacant lot so that it's a little corner pocket park. It might be painting the road so that it has crosswalks. It might be a group of people volunteering to do small exterior renovations on people's single family homes where they're on fixed incomes and they can't afford the renovations anymore. Right? There's tons of things that communities are doing to make the difference happen, and you can do them on main streets. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that there's a ton of bias in this. And I was talking about the politics before, but there are a lot of places where the people with the political control or the money are not the people in the community. We have Black communities right next to white main streets that are neglected, even though they have a great neighborhood main street that could be there. And I think we need to really speak out about it and say, you know, this is what's going on. Baltimore actually did a phenomenal analysis a couple of years ago that looked at where were all of the capital money, all of the things like building schools or renovating things that the city spent money on, where was it going? And they found that, let me see if I get the numbers right, that the neighborhoods that were predominantly white had projects that were worth twice as much as the neighborhoods that were predominantly Black. And that when you looked at across income levels in different neighborhoods, it was like 3 times as much. And so it showed you that money was going to the places that were already succeeding. And so we start looking at, or because of income, or they were biased towards white dominant neighborhoods. And so I think it's important to recognize that there is an amazing amount of systemic racism and biases in all of this decision making, and that we need to have these open conversations about where the money has gone in the past and where the under-invested neighborhoods really are that have this kind of potential, and sometimes go after independent funding from foundations or from national entities like LISC or Enterprise that can invest from national buckets of nonprofit money into some of these projects, because the community may not get the support that they need from the people in their local government or their local agencies, but there are other ways around it.
So, and you mentioned, you somehow got me started thinking here a little bit about, you know, the idealistic, the utopian version of this. And so to me, Nicole Jordan brought up the thing about, we talked about workforce housing. She brought up Milton Hershey, what he did in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where he created a whole community. Now that's fraught with, you know, company towns, company script. There's some dangers there. Nobody's proposing that now, though, are they? I mean, there's nobody out there looking at that type of company town type of situation.
Not that I can think of, but there are definitely some large businesses that provide down payment support for employees who want to live in the surrounding areas.
Okay.
I don't, off the top of my head, I can't think of any major corporations that's doing the development anymore.
Okay. Well, I'm going to
Doesn't
go
mean
to.
it's not happening. I just can't think of it off the top of my head.
Okay. So I'm going to go to the next slide, if I
Gene,
can.
I will say, if the New York Times has a interesting podcast out right now. It's entitled "Nice White Parents," and it's about I think it's like 6 sessions long, and it follows one New York City school inside the New York City public school system throughout its lifespan of having people interact with it and the parents that were involved in it and how it's shifted and changed. And at any rate, at one point, the New York City school system, in order to try and get the community rallied around some of the changes they were making inside this one school, had these really great sort of paraphernalia videos, and we had a choir singing with a multiracial choir singing, you know, patriotic music, et cetera, et cetera. But it was the point I'm trying to make, and what wound up happening was they created this utopian situation that was never going to be achievable. And so I think as we're talking about creating a community plan, in whatever form that takes, what level of finish that is, it has got to be something that takes it into context where you are, and it's something that is achievable. So you're not trying for this utopian thing that is never going to happen.
Okay. Now, I will caution both of you young ladies that I've now lost magically my view of the two of you. I have no idea where it went, so I can't see your facial expressions to know who wants to say something next. So
We're still here.
I'm going to flounder for a while here. You're going, well, that's nothing new. So the screen you should be looking at is zoning now NIMBY and cave people. For those of you not familiar with that, NIMBY is not in my backyard, and cave people are citizens against virtually everything. And this will show you the growing regulation of land use, and this is the cases. What this is the cases per million people. These are cases filed in opposition to proposed zoning changes. And as you see, starting off, after World War II, it was very modest, but now it's becoming much more of a thing. And so zoning has become something, and my personal opinion is that everybody out there who is into anti-poverty advocacy needs to understand how zoning affects all this. So the question for you folks, and again, yes, I'm doing all these, I'm touching on all the third rails, okay? Is zoning a good thing or a bad thing, or is it just a thing? And why do you think it's become so contentious now?
So I think zoning is a good thing. I am a city planner by training, so I sort of feel like I'm compelled to say that. But zoning just means the kind of thing that can be built there. It can be by use, right? It can say this is housing or this is shops, or it can be this area should be 2-story buildings with an awning out front. And I think it's important to realize that zoning also means we can add layers. So there's zoning in San Francisco that says certain properties or certain zones have to include ground floor that breaks out into smaller footprint space so that there are smaller storefronts that local businesses can afford. Zoning means that we can create incentives like inclusionary zoning that requires new large developments to include affordable housing. And so as much as I think that saying the market will solve everything, the market does not solve things for people who do not have access to it. And so we need to very purposefully be involved in the zoning and the pieces around that decision making, which is incredibly political. It's all politics, to say that zoning needs to be inclusive. We've used zoning historically as part of racism, right? Zoning is what separated different uses and said single family housing on a half-acre lot is only going to be here, which was a way to say only people who can afford this are only the people who are going to live here, as opposed to saying we want to create a place which has all different kinds of housing types and job types within a community. And so we need to address the awful history of zoning and the systemic racism that's baked into it, and actually move forward and say we can use zoning for the good that we want to create. We have to be purposeful about it, and we have to be willing to engage in the political advocacy around the zoning changes that need to happen.
Frances?
I don't know if I could add anything more to that. That's spot on. I mean, like what I said at the very top was the built environment is we create literal structures that limit and barrier people in ways that prevent them from being able to evolve and bridge out of various states. And the same thing can be said for the policies like zoning. And I think what we do at this juncture is we need to take a look at how we deal with land use, and we need to. I think we need to be willing to entertain changes to things at appropriate times with regards to doing an analysis of what our current zoning code is, and making sure it's taking into account not just the property owners' values, but the community's values. So it's, I think we have to have zoning. You have to have an idea of where things go. It helps protect other properties, especially when it comes to another threat. You haven't gotten there yet, but maybe I'll bring it up, which is what's happening with the environment. If we don't zone things properly, we will wind up with people investing in built environment uses in a floodplain that it should never be. Look what happened in Texas a couple of years ago. So at any rate, we certainly need zoning, but we can be better about the way in which we administer it.
Okay, so zoning back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, I think about it was also used for redlining. And I've seen the data. The second think tank I worked for was one that did healthcare and human services. That's where I met Phil Duvall. They recently came out with a report. You can match perfectly COVID deaths to redlining in Cleveland, which has not officially occurred in 40 years or whatever. Now, one of the ways we decide to fix redlining is with the Community Reinvestment Act, aka CRAs. Okay, and so I had this question pop up from, let me see here, if I can. This is from Adam. We had Hartnett. We had a CRA in our community that has been renewed. The issue with this CRA is that while the reinvestment area includes 2 communities, the reinvestment has been predominantly focused on the main street that is associated and situations proximal to the white community, and the areas in and closer to black communities have been put off for later. Ilana, you brought this up. You alluded to this earlier. How do you work with that set of circumstances is direct question. Yes, I'm asking all the ugly questions here. Sorry.
This one is politics too, right? It's the politics of who gets the money spent on them. And I think, so one of the things that we do with communities when we work with them is work to find connectors. And I talk about connectors with a capital C. Connectors are people who believe in the community, who have standing in the community, and who know a specific part of the community. So often when we work with an economic development department in a city, they know if the staff is white, they'll know the white business owners. If the staff is black, they might know black and white business owners. Like it's very clear that nobody knows everybody, and so we have to find connectors who have relationships in different parts of our community. They might work particularly with people who were formerly incarcerated and are working to rebuild their lives. They might work specifically with immigrant populations. They might be not just work with them, but they might be part of those communities. And they are people who have the future of their community and future of the broader community at heart. One of the things we do is we work to bring these people together to understand what they think needs to happen, and then actually bring them together with some of the decision makers that have been there for a long time. So bank representatives are another piece of that. And we work really clearly with them to build those relationships, because it is all relationship based at the end of the day. Maybe there aren't packaged projects. Maybe the bank doesn't understand that there are developers who could do the projects there. And maybe there are barriers that we just don't understand to that development, along with all of the historic systemic racism packed into it. I'm not going to excuse one or the other, but I think it's important to sit down and have the conversation both with the people who have the future of that neighborhood at heart, but also with the people who do hold the power, especially of investment, and being really purposeful. I'll go back to the word again, purposeful and intentional of having these hard conversations like Gene brings up, of saying, this development didn't happen, this investment didn't happen. We have this history of no investment over here. And the bank is going to say, well, we don't think that is an investment that's going to pencil. And then we have to understand, why is it not going to pencil? And then we need to figure out how the city can back it up or guarantee something, because there are solutions to all of the challenges, but we have to have that open conversation to be able to understand what that challenge is.
Okay. All right, Frances, anything? We are down to 10 minutes before anything more on this for you.
Yeah, not really. I mean, the CRA are in the year 2020. The community CRA has been discussed quite a bit with regards to all the major banks, trying to address the issues of today and really come at it. And so for so long, the CRA was sort of, oh, well, we've hit our standard. We're done. We don't have to invest in the community anymore. We've already met our CRA requirement for this year. And so that is just not really.
Oh, you are kidding me. You're not kidding me.
That's not really what we're supposed to be doing here, folks. We're supposed to be helping the community because we should be, not because you're just having to hit your CRA requirements and check the box and you're out of town. So yeah, it's very interesting the way in which we incentivize the work being done in our communities, because it can be very lumpy unless there is a comprehensive, prioritized view on the way in which the tail wags the dog, and we wind up having some very lumpy, back to your point, effects that is not felt by most people in the community.
Okay. All right. So just a few things here. First of all, I have up Ilana's contact information here on the screen. So for those of you who would like to get this on your cell phone right now, she's also been putting it on the chat box for folks how to contact her. Take your phone out, take a photo of this one. I'm going to count to 10. If you go ahead and do that. If you have further follow-up questions for Ilana, and I'm now going to take it down to Frances, and here's Frances. And I don't think I've said this enough while people are taking photos of these contact informations. I just really want to thank. This has been, I think, for the majority of folks. I asked AHA Process to do this because this is something I've never heard folks discuss. And I just want to give you couple last slides, just so you know what you're up against. Two guys from Harvard were the ones who did this, and take a photo here. Here's the site for their academic study. And this was a very extensive study. It has 13 pages of calculus with this. But what the Curley effect is, and this is just the first two sentences out of this scientific study that they published, and very well known. James Michael Curley, a 4-time mayor of Boston, used wasteful redistribution to his poor Irish constituents and incendiary rhetoric to encourage richer citizens to immigrate from Boston, thereby shaping the electorate in his favor. Boston, as a consequence, stagnated, but Curley kept winning election. I've seen this go on time after time after time, where the elected officials want to have an ecosystem that supports only the folks that vote for them. And you may find this in manifests itself in a couple different ways. If you're looking for what we call your collar counties, those are your suburban counties that surround the larger urban county, they do that by keeping out affordable housing opportunities in those counties. Okay. And for those of you from the Miami Valley in Ohio, you've seen that action taken many times by Greene County against the city of Dayton, trying to bring bus routes out to their shopping malls, where the employees for that shopping mall, we used to have a thing here in Ohio called shopping malls, which I don't think will exist much longer, but they tried to kill it. So what my point is, politics and poverty can be forms of dysfunctionality, what should be a self-correcting system. Okay, so you need to understand politics. And I think both Ilana and Frances have alluded to this, that some of the times what you're really encountering here is a political problem. And so if you want to, so on October 9th, there's an all-day virtual seminar with Phil and myself. Here's the contact information for it. You can take a photo of that if you're interested. That just about covers it. Those of you who've seen me do presentations before, this is my only slide of humor in this whole thing, okay? And this is also now the workshop evaluation. And that is my timer going off, telling me we just have just a few minutes left. Ilana and Frances, any last minute things you'd like to restate or say, oh my gosh, Gene, you forgot this. What would you like to say?
I think,
I want to say thank you.
No, yeah, sure. The AHA process and all of the good training, I imagine this world of people who are working so diligently on people, right? You are out, all these advocates are out in the community really trying to solve people problems, and that is great. But if it's not done in concert with the built environment, then the effect of your work will be limited. And so we needed to be doing this together. Otherwise, we're going to head two different directions and won't get to happy very fast.
And before we go to Ilana, I just want to remind everybody that traditionally in America, we've always used manufacturing to help the poor and working poor move up to the middle class, if not for themselves, at least for their children and grandchildren. Okay, yet we're finding those doors increasingly shut for us. And when I hear Ilana talk about small manufacturing shops that only have maybe five employees, you just make my heart go pitter patter. You do know that, don't you? So, Ilana, any last words from you?
Well, I'll build on what Frances was talking about. I think that it is about people and it's about places, right? And I think it's important to think about there are amazing qualities and value in the people in our communities, and it doesn't matter if they're struggling in poverty or their background. People have amazing knowledge and amazing skills, and I think we have a wonderful opportunity, not just a responsibility, but a wonderful opportunity to really help those people see the value in what they know how to do, help them become businesses if that's what they're interested in. It could be a part-time or a full-time or something that grows, but to really help people understand how they can take a skill that they have, a thing that they make, the food, the quilting, the whatever it is, the sewing, the woodworking, or the hardware that they want to invent, right? The sky's the limit, and really understand that this is something that's valuable, and really can make a difference for them in their neighborhood. And then on top of that, think about the space for it. How does this help a neighborhood create its own energy and not be dependent on some of these other outside forces to reinvest in itself? And there are tools for that, some of which we talked about, but a lot of other ones. And there is an opportunity to sort of get control over some of that Main Street property and really become a space where that opportunity for growth happens, all by the community and by the neighborhood, to be able to create that wealth and create a place that is thriving because of the people who live there and work there. And thank you so much for including me in this conversation. It's been wonderful.
Very happy. And Lynn and Michelle, so is there any what's next steps people need to be aware of as to, we have an event tonight.
We do. We have an event that starts at 6 p.m. Central. It'll be Getting Ahead, graduates and facilitators sharing their story. So you're welcome to register. If you've already registered, then just get on a few minutes early, and we'll have that time this evening. And then again tomorrow, we have another breakout session in the morning, and then Ruby will close out the conference with a keynote tomorrow late morning. So thank you all for presenting.
And we'll
Thank
see
you.
you all remotely this evening. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.